Hey guys, tonight we're going to step into a world that's less comfortably medieval and more. You're definitely not going to survive this. Imagine it, you're trudging along cobblestone streets, your joints aching with each step, your eyes squinting at the dim light of a torch as you make your way through a city that hasn't changed much in hundreds of years. You might be old in today's terms, but here, in the medieval world, you're practically a walking relic, someone who's lived far beyond what anyone would consider a decent lifespan. Your body creaks with every movement, and you're just hoping you don't snap something in the process. At this point, you could use a good nap, but there's no time for that. The world is too dangerous. And in this reality, if you're not careful, your body won't even let you make it through the day. It's not an easy life, especially when you factor in the dirt, the grime, the lack of real medicine, and the constant threat of disease, war, and starvation. If you thought being old today was tough, you've got another thing coming. The idea of growing old gracefully was an absolute joke back in the Middle Ages. You don't get to retire in peace with a cosy little cottage by the sea. You're lucky if you make it to the age of 40, let alone survive the ravages of time, politics, and nature. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, go ahead and post your location and the time where you are, because we're in for an experience that spans centuries. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you stumble through the mud-filled streets, you can feel the weight of your years pressing down on your weary body. The world around you is a place of constant noise, carriages clattering on the cobblestones, street vendors shouting their wares, children running wild and unruly, and a smell that can only be described as medieval. It's a pungent mix of sweat, smoke, rotting food, and of course, human body odour. You're still alive. But it's clear you're not in the prime of your life. And that's an understatement. The thought of surviving in this chaotic, disease-ridden, and perilous world is as exhausting as it is daunting. You've seen the other old folks around town, hunched over and moving slowly, yet somehow managing to get by, even if it's just barely. Their faces are lined with deep wrinkles, and their clothes are threadbare from years of wear. You think back to when you were younger. Those were the days when you had energy, when you could work the land, run errands for the local lord, and even fight in a battle or two if you had to. But those days are long gone now. Your days are spent dodging the dangerous elements of medieval life, rampant diseases like the plague, food scarcity, and the ever-present threat of violence from both bandits and kings alike. But don't get it twisted, even though you're older now. There's still a certain kind of power in your survival. You might not be out there charging into battle or building grand structures, but you're alive, and that in itself is a feat. The average life expectancy during the Middle Ages was a brutal 30 to 40 years if you managed to survive childhood, which was no easy task. Disease, malnutrition, and war claimed most lives before people even hit their prime. If you made it to 40 or 50, you were considered lucky. But you wouldn't feel like you'd won the lottery. Your bones would ache, your senses would dull, and the idea of moving without a stick or some form of support would be laughable. Yet somehow, you're still here. And let's not even get started on the physical toll of age in medieval times. Without modern medicine, the idea of growing old gracefully simply wasn't an option. Your teeth are probably falling out, your eyesight's fading, and your back aches as if every movement is a reminder of your once young body. You might have had a few decades of prime time, but the clock has long since run out. Your legs are slow, your skin is thin and wrinkled, and your once vibrant hair has turned the colour of snow. You are living proof that the human body wasn't exactly built for longevity. In this world, The elderly were often seen as little more than a burden, a lot of the time. People in their advanced years were relegated to begging on the streets, or, if they were lucky, cared for by their children, though the concept of a nursing home was still centuries away from being invented. So, if you were a middle-aged person, you had one of two options: stay sharp and fight to the bitter end, or give in to age and decline. And to make it through this era in one piece, you really did have to fight. The struggle to survive in the medieval world wasn't just about physical endurance, it was about managing to stay relevant, to not be seen as someone who was too old to contribute. Let's take a moment to talk about the medieval view of aging. You weren't just getting old, you were slowly withering away back then. Your body's slow decline was a reminder of how fragile human life was. There wasn't a lot of optimism in the air. No inspirational quotes about aging like we have today. Instead, you'd hear more about how aging meant the loss of strength, the loss of hair, and the loss of vitality. The idea of being an elder with wisdom, grace and respect was just that, an idea. In the medieval period, the elderly were mostly seen as a drain on resources, an inconvenience, and yet, somehow, you're still here, proving everyone wrong. But let's not paint too grim a picture. Old age wasn't all doom and gloom. If you were lucky, you might have had a place in the community, especially if you were one of the rare few who managed to survive long enough to gather any sort of wealth or status, even though life expectancy was low. Some elderly individuals enjoyed a bit more respect, sometimes even a little bit of luxury, especially if they had children who were doing well. Of course, that was far from guaranteed. If you were poor, you were just as likely to be a drain on society as you were to be the wise old sage everyone came to for advice. But there was some dignity to be found in the elderly who had managed to get by for so long. But here's the kicker: your survival wasn't guaranteed. Even if you did manage to live long enough to see old age, sure, you may have made it past the age of 40, which, let's be honest, is already impressive, but you're not out of the woods yet. The harsh medieval world would still find ways to claim your life. If it wasn't the plague that took you, it might have been war. If it wasn't war, it could be hunger or the simple brutality of everyday life. In the Middle Ages, death could come at any time, for anyone, and especially for the old. The thought that you might still be around in your 50s or 60s was a huge accomplishment, but it was far from a guarantee that you'd live a full, peaceful life. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually had a true understanding of aging, or if it was simply seen as something to be feared and avoided. The general consensus, though, is that the elderly were often marginalised, neglected, or even discarded. After all, you weren't contributing to the economy, and you weren't out there battling in wars or farming fields. You were becoming a reminder of the harshness of life, a living symbol of time's inevitable toll on the human body. But still, you made it through, perhaps just barely, but you did, and that's something to be proud of. So, the real question remains, how did you survive? How did you, as an elderly person in medieval times, manage to keep going when so many around you were falling like flies? Spoiler. It wasn't just about luck, it was about being resourceful, being tough, and finding ways to work around your body's limitations. There's a lot more to this story than you might think, and I'll be diving into all of it in the next section. Now that we've painted the picture of your initial struggle, let's dive into what it actually took to keep surviving as an old person during the Middle Ages. You didn't get to just sit back and relax, wrapped up in some cosy blanket by the fire while sipping tea. Oh no, not unless you were exceptionally lucky, which, spoiler alert, you probably weren't. No, surviving as an old person in this brutal period required every ounce of resourcefulness, grit, and plain old survival instinct. To live this long, you had to work with what you had and, well, You didn't have much. Let's start with something simple, your daily routine. If you were an elderly person in the Middle Ages, you likely still had to contribute in some way, even if it was just to keep your body alive. Depending on where you lived, whether in a village, a city, or even as part of a lord's estate, you were expected to do something. The fact that you didn't have the luxury of a pension or retirement funds meant that you either had to keep working or find ways to get by without doing so. But even if you were lucky enough to find someone to take you in or manage to scrape by, there was always the issue of food. Food was always a major concern, especially for older folks in medieval times. There wasn't exactly a grocery store down the street where you could pop in and grab some lunch. No, food was an everyday hustle. The elderly had to rely on what little they could grow, forage, or barter for. And that was if they were fortunate enough to have any land or goods. If not, well, you relied on the kindness of others, or more often than not, on the charity of the church. Yes, the church, that big institution of medieval life, often played a role in ensuring that the old didn't starve to death. But here's the kicker: if you weren't in good standing with the local clergy, or didn't have enough to offer in return, that food was scarce. You could be left to wither away on the streets or in your tiny cottage, barely scraping by. Even if you had some land and managed to farm, the physical toll of such work on an elderly body was immense. The physical labour that once came naturally to you in your younger days now became a struggle. Imagine having to plough the fields or tend to livestock with aching joints and a body that felt like it was constantly rebelling against you. Yet, for many, that was the reality. You worked until your body couldn't handle it anymore, and, let's be honest, it often couldn't last that long. But let's not sugarcoat it. You were still a part of the social fabric, but it wasn't easy. The elderly often occupied one of the lowest rungs on the societal ladder, especially if they were poor. You could be seen as a burden, not just on your immediate family, but on society as a whole. Medieval society was centred around the idea of usefulness. If you couldn't contribute, whether that was through working, fighting, or creating, then you had little value in the eyes of others. You were often ignored, dismissed, and sometimes even left to fend for yourself in whatever way you could. And that's not even touching on the issue of illness. As an old person, you were far more vulnerable to diseases that swept through medieval Europe. You're no stranger to illness, but this was a different beast altogether. The Black Death, smallpox, leprosy, and other contagious diseases were an ever-present threat. They didn't discriminate based on age. Everybody could be affected. But, of course, older people were far more likely to succumb to these illnesses. You were also much more susceptible to the horrific side effects of these diseases, particularly if your immune system had already been weakened by years of hard living. If you weren't fighting off infection, you were trying to avoid the next plague that was lurking just around the corner. Now, let's talk about the medical side of things. You didn't exactly have access to modern medicine, or even the medieval equivalent of a doctor. Instead, you had to rely on remedies that ranged from the somewhat effective to the downright bizarre medieval medicine. While not completely useless, was rudimentary at best. When you got sick, you didn't have a friendly pharmacist you could run to for antibiotics. Instead, you were at the mercy of the local healer, or perhaps even the clergy, who often dabbled in some rather odd treatments. Some of the remedies were based on ancient practices, some of them were folk traditions, and others were just straight up odd. Take, for instance, the use of leeches. Yes, leeches. If you were lucky enough to have access to a healer, you might have had leeches applied to your skin in an attempt to balance your humours, a concept medieval medicine swore by. The theory was that by bleeding you, these bloodsuckers would help rid you of the bad blood in your system, which was supposedly causing your ailments. While leeches might seem absurd now, they were a common and accepted forms of treatment for many illnesses. Of course, this didn't do much for your aches and pains, nor did it really address the root causes of your ailments, but it was something. And don't even get me started on medieval hygiene, or rather, the lack of it. As an old person in this era, you didn't have the luxury of daily showers or even clean water at your disposal. Bathing was a rare and often public event, and many people, especially the elderly, didn't have the means or ability to properly clean themselves. The idea of cleanliness wasn't really understood in the way we see it today, and hygiene practices were minimal at best. You might have used a cloth or some herbs to freshen up a bit, but for the most part, you just had to make do with the smell of the world around you and yourself. Keeping up appearances was tough enough, but when you're fighting age, disease, and the elements, there's no real time for a spa day. Of course, one of the hardest realities of medieval old age was the complete lack of modern conveniences. There were no heating systems, no comfy chairs, no memory foam mattresses, and definitely no electric blankets to keep you warm at night. You were lucky if you had a woolen blanket or a fire to keep the cold at bay. As an older person, the winters could be absolutely brutal. Cold, damp homes with drafty windows were a constant source of discomfort. When the chill set in, your old bones didn't just ache, they froze. It was a stark contrast to the image of cosy old age we often picture today. There were no warm cups of tea to soothe your sore throat, no electric heaters to keep your body from shivering. You were on your own in that respect, relying on what little you could do to keep warm. Despite all of this hardship, there was still something that kept you going, the need to stay alive. That may sound simple, but in a world that offered so many ways to die, it was a small victory each day you woke up. Yes, the medieval world was full of dangers, diseases, and discomforts, but there was a certain kind of strength in the old people who managed to hold on. It wasn't just about survival, it was about finding ways to adapt, even when the odds were stacked against you. The elderly who survived in the Middle Ages had a resilience that is often overlooked in our modern world. They didn't have modern medicine, technology, or comforts, yet they somehow made it through, and that, in itself, is a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. Historians still argue about whether medieval people understood the aging process as we do now, or if they simply accepted it as a natural and unavoidable part of life. But what is clear is that survival was more about making do with what you had, using every ounce of your remaining strength to carry on. It wasn't easy, it wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. Now that you've got a sense of what it took to survive in old age in the Middle Ages, you can see just how tough it really was. But here's the thing, you're still alive, and you've made it this far. That's something. But as we move on to the next section, we're going to talk about the role that community and family played in your survival, and how being part of a larger network may have been your greatest asset in making it through to the next day. As we continue on your journey through the complexities of surviving as an old person in medieval Europe, we now turn our focus to the role of community and family. Sure, life was tough, and your survival depended on many factors, but it would have been nearly impossible to keep going without the assistance of others. That's the brutal truth in the Middle Ages. The old often relied heavily on the kindness, or lack thereof, of their families, neighbours, and the broader social structure. But what did that really look like? Was there any semblance of care or compassion, or was it a dog-eat-dog world where the elderly were left to rot alone? Well, strap in, because it's time to get real about how family and community dynamics influenced your ability to survive. If you were lucky enough to have children or extended family, that's when the cards really stacked in your favour. In medieval times, family was everything, and and your survival often depended on whether your children were willing or able to take you in and care for you. But here's the catch: your kids weren't guaranteed to look after you just because they were your offspring. It wasn't all warm, fuzzy moments and Thanksgiving dinners. In fact, sometimes family relationships were strained, and it could be more of a transactional arrangement. If your children were well off or in a position of power, they might have had the resources to care for you. But if they were struggling too, you might have been left to fend for yourself, or worse, abandoned. But even if you didn't have a supportive family structure, you still had your community. You lived in a world where people often depended on one another for basic survival. If you were in a village, for instance, it wasn't uncommon for neighbours to help each other out, even if it was just by offering a bit of food or lending a hand when you were too sick or frail to work. The medieval community was a tight-knit web of relationships, with everyone playing a part, whether that was through shared labour, support during tough times, or the occasional helping hand when someone fell ill. There was, however, one key issue with this communal approach. Everyone had their own struggles to contend with. You see, most medieval communities were not wealthy by modern standards. Most villagers were peasants who worked hard to survive, and any help given to an elderly person was often offered grudgingly or out of a sense of obligation, not out of a deep-seated desire to do good. This dynamic often created a just enough to get by scenario, where the elderly may have received the bare minimum care, just enough to survive another season when times got tough. The elderly were often the first to be overlooked or discarded, especially if they had no means of repaying the favour. But let's dig a little deeper. The church, despite its many flaws, did provide some semblance of structure when it came to the care of the elderly. In medieval Europe, the church was often seen as the ultimate source of charity and protection, and it was sometimes the church that would offer shelter to those who had no one else to turn to. If you had fallen on hard times and had no family to take care of you, the church was there sometimes. They offered a form of welfare, but it was nothing close to the safety net we'd expect today. While some monasteries and convents offered food, lodging, and care for the elderly, others were less than willing to extend that kindness. It all depended on the wealth and generosity of the particular institution. But the church didn't just provide refuge in the physical sense, it also provided a certain level of moral and spiritual comfort. For many old people in the Middle Ages, this was perhaps the greatest comfort of all. The church offered a structured environment where the elderly could find a sense of peace or meaning in their later years. There was a belief that the elderly, especially those nearing death, were closer to God and would receive a special place in heaven. The church offered solace, but it didn't offer much in the way of physical care or material help, which was a bit of a problem for the elderly who couldn't take care of themselves. Of course, things weren't all bad. If you were lucky enough to have a family that cared for you and a community that looked out for each other, life could be somewhat manageable. But, as mentioned earlier, the harsh realities of medieval life meant that many older people were left to their own devices. The elderly often became somewhat invisible in the eyes of society. Once your usefulness in the community had passed, you were sometimes regarded as a burden. It wasn't a society built on kindness, and compassion was often in short supply when resources were scarce. Now, this wasn't to say that there weren't good people out there. Of course, there were exceptions. Many elderly people had devoted children who cared for them, provided them with food, or made sure they had a warm bed at night. It was just that. When you lived in an era where every day was a struggle for survival, family and community ties weren't always strong enough to carry you through to the end. Still, despite these challenges, there were some silver linings. The sense of community and mutual aid among people living in the same area could create an environment in which the elderly could find some measure of dignity and care. The relationship between the elderly and the younger generations wasn't just about survival, it was also about wisdom. Even if you weren't physically strong enough to help with the daily chores, your life experience and knowledge of the world could still be of value as an old person. You could still offer advice, teach, and provide a level of mentorship to younger generations. This kind of wisdom was highly respected in many medieval communities, and while it might not have paid the bills, it did mean that the elderly still held some sway in their social circles. Now, let's talk about the role of the guilds. Yes, those often overlooked organisations were critical in providing support to their members, including the elderly. If you were a craftsman or had a specific skill, you might have been part of a guild, and this could mean more than just economic stability. Guilds sometimes provided assistance to their elderly members, offering them a place to live or providing them with a small pension. But don't get too excited. Guilds were by no means guaranteed to provide care, and many elderly people found themselves without the support they needed. The reality was that if you were elderly, you had to be prepared to fend for yourself most of the time. Historians still argue about the role that social structures like guilds and the church played in the lives of the elderly, and whether their influence was as significant as we might think today. Some believe that the church and the guilds provided vital support, while others argue that these institutions were just as likely to neglect the elderly as to help them. But what is clear is that survival in the Middle Ages was never a given, and those who made it into old age had to rely on a combination of luck, family, and community to make it through. At the end of the day, survival for the elderly in medieval times wasn't about thriving, it was about getting by. It was about finding a place in the world when the world wasn't built for you. And it was about accepting that kindness and generosity were in short supply. But even in such difficult circumstances, the elderly found ways to adapt. They learned to rely on one another and their communities, and in doing so, they created a sense of solidarity that helped them survive the harshest of times. So, now that we've covered the importance of community and family in your medieval survival story, let's shift gears and explore how the harsh realities of medieval medicine and healthcare made it even more difficult for old people like you to stay alive. You thought the struggle was over once you found a little help from your neighbours? Think again. Surviving sickness in the Middle Ages was a whole new challenge. Alright, now that we've discussed the intricacies of family dynamics and community support, let's take a moment to talk about something even more critical: surviving sickness in the medieval world. Spoiler alert, it wasn't pretty. If you thought surviving medieval life as an old person was challenging, add in a bout of illness and you were in serious trouble. You see, medieval medicine was about as effective as a wet napkin in a sword fight. And don't even get me started on the treatments. They were either outdated, bizarre, or downright dangerous. But for an old person like you, it wasn't just the actual disease that could kill you, it was the complete lack of medical understanding and care that stood in the way of survival. If you weren't already feeling vulnerable just by being elderly, then adding sickness into the mix was like adding a second layer of misery. First, let's talk about your average medieval doctor, or as they were often known, barbers. Yes, the same people who were also in charge of cutting hair, shaving beards, and pulling teeth. That's right, being old and sick in medieval Europe meant you had to put your trust in a barber surgeon, who was more likely to hack off a limb than save it. These so-called professionals didn't have the faintest clue about germs or bacteria. The concept of infection was practically unheard of, and their approach to healing often involved bloodletting, herbal concoctions, and a range of other remedies that, frankly, were about as effective as throwing dice and hoping for the best. Bloodletting was the go-to method for treating nearly every ailment, whether you had a fever, a cough, or just felt off. A good old-fashioned bloodletting session was supposed to help restore your humours. Don't ask me what that means, no one really knew. The idea was that by draining a certain amount of blood, the body could be rebalanced. However, if you were an old person, the thought of losing any amount of blood was probably the last thing your fragile body needed. It was a gamble, either you died from the disease or you died from the treatment. It's like choosing between drowning and burning. Neither option is great, but at least you get some variety. But let's not forget about the actual medicinal herbs, some of which were no better than the bloodletting. You might have been given an herbal remedy, but there's a good chance it did more harm than good, if you were lucky. It might have been something relatively harmless, like peppermint or ginger, both of which, surprisingly, still have medicinal uses today. However, if your medieval doctor was feeling particularly adventurous, you might have been given a concoction involving foxglove, which contains digitalis, a substance that can cause heart failure in large doses, or even mercury, which was used to treat everything from syphilis to digestive issues. So, while you were hoping for some relief, you might just be making things worse with these dangerous substances. Historians still argue over whether medieval treatments were completely useless, or whether there were some hidden gems in the mix. Some claim that, even though medieval medicine was flawed, there were still some practices like the use of herbal remedies that had their moments. However, when it came to old age, the truth was that most of the treatments were simply too little. Too late, after all. You couldn't just pop a pill and get back to your normal routine when you were in your 70s or 80s, suffering from ailments that would have been manageable today. The best case scenario was that you might have been able to muddle through your illness, but more often than not, age itself was the real enemy. Now, let's talk about some of the diseases that could have gotten you. It wasn't just a cough or a sore throat that could kill you. You had to deal with the likes of the bubonic plague, dysentery, smallpox, and, of course, the ever-popular the Black Death. If you were living in a city, you were even more at risk because of overcrowded conditions and poor sanitation. Think about it, medieval towns didn't have running water, sewage systems, or modern hygiene practices. The streets were often filled with human waste, and the local wells were frequently contaminated. So, if you were an old person trying to survive in such a cesspool of disease, you didn't stand much of a chance. Your immune system was already weakened by age, and without proper care, a simple infection could lead to your death. And no, the plague didn't care. If you were 25 or 75, you were just as likely to die from it as the next person. But let's say you somehow managed to avoid the plague. Maybe you didn't catch a viral infection, or perhaps you lived in a rural area where the disease didn't spread as rapidly. Well, you still had to worry about other illnesses that could take you down. Pneumonia, for example, was a common killer among the elderly. And, let's be honest, being sick in medieval times wasn't as simple as popping a thermometer in your mouth and getting a reading. A cough or chest pain could be a sign of a deadly lung infection that would kill you in a matter of days, and with no antibiotics. Good luck with that. The elderly were more susceptible to diseases that weaken their immune system and, over time, could leave them vulnerable to other infections. You might have thought, hey, I'm old, but I've lived a long life, I've seen it all, and nothing's going to take me down. Well, spoiler alert, old age itself was a silent killer. The older you got, the harder it became to fight off even the smallest of illnesses. Your immune system was slowly losing its ability to protect you, and your body simply couldn't heal itself the way it used to. You might have had some fight left in you, but your body just couldn't keep up. One simple infection could be the thing that pushed you over the edge, and when that happened, no amount of medieval medicine could save you. Now, let's get back to those medieval doctors. They weren't all completely hopeless. Some were actually trying to get things right, at least, to some extent. They might have had a rudimentary understanding of anatomy and disease, even if they didn't fully grasp the mechanisms of illness. But let's be real for the elderly. The reality was that there weren't any magic solutions. You were basically on your own, hoping that you wouldn't catch something deadly and that your family or community would at least try to help you out. If you were really unlucky, you'd find yourself being treated by the local barber surgeon, who was more likely to make things worse than better. But hey, at least you wouldn't be alone, right? You'd have some fun company while you waited for the inevitable. Historians are still debating just how bad medieval medicine was for the elderly. Some argue that, even with all the weird and ineffective treatments, the elderly still had some means of survival, if they lived in the right conditions. Others contend that, for most people, medical care was nothing more than a death sentence waiting to happen. The reality, as always, probably lies somewhere in the middle. If you were lucky, you'd survive long enough to get a proper treatment. But if you weren't, well, you were pretty much at the mercy of whatever doctor or healer was nearby. But hey, let's wrap things up on a lighter note. If you didn't die from an illness, you might have been lucky enough to see some of your children, grandchildren, or even great-grandchildren grow up. It wasn't all bad, right? And if you did survive long enough, at least you got to witness the occasional social change, maybe even getting a few good laughs with your fellow old-timers at the local tavern. Of course, that assumes you were lucky enough to make it to the tavern before disease, old age, or the local priest took you down. In any case, the medieval world wasn't exactly friendly to old people, but somehow, some of you managed to stick it out. Now, let's see how you managed to navigate the social and cultural changes as the Middle Ages slowly gave way to the Renaissance. Who knows, maybe there were some perks after all. Now that we've covered the grueling challenges of surviving illness in medieval times, let's turn our attention to something a bit more social. Living as an old person in the Middle Ages meant more than just physical survival. It also involved navigating a world that wasn't exactly known for its respect for the elderly. In fact, society back then wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet for you just because you'd managed to hang around longer than most. The medieval mindset wasn't particularly fond of people who lived past their prime. In fact, older adults were often treated with a strange mixture of pity and suspicion. The youth, more concerned with keeping themselves alive, generally didn't have much time for the elderly. But let's not get too gloomy just yet, because there were definitely some perks to being an elder in medieval Europe. Oh yes, I'm talking about status, wisdom, and even respect. But here's the catch. It wasn't guaranteed, and it wasn't the same for everyone. For starters, let's talk about status. Depending on your wealth, occupation, and your place in society, being an old person might have meant you were actually considered wise and important. In some areas, elders were regarded as the keepers of knowledge, revered for their life experience and the wisdom they could impart to the younger generations. This might sound a bit strange, given how we've talked about how medieval society didn't exactly respect its old folk. But it's true. If you were part of the upper classes, or if you had access to resources, your age was actually an asset. Old age came with a certain amount of prestige, especially if you could maintain some form of power or influence in your community. Now, if you were living in a small village, your situation might have been a little different. The social hierarchy in these medieval towns and villages was something of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the elderly were often seen as respected figures because they had seen more than anyone else. People looked to them for guidance, for counsel, and for stories about the past. But on the other hand, if you weren't rich, powerful, or particularly well connected, your old age could make you a target. It wasn't uncommon for younger members of society to dismiss the elderly as irrelevant or weak, and in some cases, the elderly were viewed as a drain on resources. After all, with no modern pension system, no safety net to speak of, and no healthcare to speak of unless you count the aforementioned barber surgeons, old age wasn't exactly something you could afford to have without a backup plan. And if you didn't have a family or a solid position in the community, you were left to your own devices, struggling to survive on whatever scraps society was willing to give you. But let's not get too negative. There were definitely moments in the medieval world where being an old person had its perks, in fact, for certain parts of society. Old age was synonymous with power. Take the church, for example. The clergy in the Middle Ages held tremendous sway over both secular and spiritual matters. If you were an old priest or bishop, you could wield considerable influence, not just because of your religious authority, but because your long life had granted you a place of respect within the community. Elders in religious positions could hold courts, dispense advice, and even influence the laws of the land. The respect that came with age, when paired with the status of the clergy, meant that elderly figures were often some of the most respected in society. Now, let's talk about the social position of older women in medieval times, because things were a little more complicated for them. Women, especially older ones, didn't have the same opportunities as men. Regardless of their age, if you were an older woman in the Middle Ages, your worth was largely tied to your ability to manage the household, produce children, and support the family, if you were lucky enough to be married. Old age meant the prospect of being cared for by your children, but there was no guarantee that your children would do right by you. Old women who had no family or were widowed were often left to fend for themselves, and even though some communities provided for them through charity, many didn't. In many cases, the elderly women who survived were those who still had some degree of usefulness to society, whether as healers, midwives, or caretakers. If you didn't fall into one of these categories, your chances of being respected and cared for in your later years were slim. So, what happens when you're old, and you're not a priest or a well-off merchant, and you don't have a family to support you? Well, you basically had to rely on whatever scraps society was willing to throw your way. In some places, elderly people were treated as burdens and often relegated to begging on the streets or surviving off the charity of others. And charity was a fickle thing. Some towns or villages had charitable systems in place, but most did not. Without a family to rely on, your best bet for survival was to become a street beggar, or to find a place in the town's almshouse, where you could live off the donations of others if you were lucky. But even then, you had to deal with the stigma of being dependent on others. Historians still argue whether the elderly were seen as valuable members of medieval society, or whether they were largely regarded as disposable. There's evidence on both sides. In some cases, older individuals were definitely valued for their life experience, particularly in rural areas where oral traditions and community-based knowledge were paramount. But in other cases, especially in more urban areas, old age could be seen as a liability, an inconvenience that society wasn't really equipped to handle. But here's the thing, despite the struggles, there were ways to make it through. In the absence of formal retirement plans or social safety nets, many elderly individuals lived in the shadow of their children or grandchildren, relying on the younger generation to care for them. This meant that if you were an older person, your family relationships were incredibly important. They could make the difference between a life of relative comfort and one of abject poverty. Still, it's not all doom and gloom, despite being surrounded by adversity. The old people of the Middle Ages managed to maintain their dignity, and sometimes even their sense of humour. In fact, many medieval texts from the time refer to elderly figures in ways that show they were still capable of participating in society in their own unique ways. whether they were offering wisdom, managing homes, or even entertaining the community with stories of their past. The elderly in the Middle Ages were far from irrelevant. They may have had a tough time, but they still managed to leave their mark. But we can't forget that. As we said before, these stories are not guaranteed for everyone. If you were an old person living in a poor community, your chances of making it to the next year were slim, and many simply didn't. Still, the ones who did manage to survive long enough to reach old age despite all odds had one thing in common: they were incredibly resilient. So, as we move forward, let's talk about the surprising role of the elderly in medieval warfare and their surprising contributions to medieval society. Because, yes, even in their later years, some old warriors still had something to offer, now that we've seen the ups and downs of surviving the social challenges of old age in the Middle Ages. Let's shift our focus to a group of individuals who surprisingly weren't just sitting by the fire, knitting all day, the elderly warriors. Yes, you read that right. While most of us picture elderly individuals in medieval Europe as frail and weak, there were, in fact, many old soldiers who managed to live long enough to remain in the thick of things. These senior warriors didn't retire quietly into the background. They fought on, often with surprising skill and ferocity, until they had no choice but to hang up their swords for good, or until their bodies simply gave out. So, what made these elderly warriors so remarkable? Let's start by considering the physical demands of battle. Medieval combat was brutal. There were no modern weapons, no fancy armour, and no technology that could make the fighting less taxing. You had to rely on brute strength, endurance, and, above all, skill. Combatants in their prime were generally expected to be in peak physical condition, capable of wielding a sword, shield, or spear without breaking a sweat. Now, imagine being in your 60s or 70s or older and still expected to participate in battles where the stakes were high. The combat was close, and the chance of death was always a breath away. You'd think that, after decades of battle, the physical toll would be too much, and many elderly soldiers would simply fall to the wayside, and that was often the case. But some elderly warriors were able to keep going, sometimes well into their 70s, and even their 80s, because they had one thing that the younger soldiers didn't experience. This experience gave them an edge that was hard to beat. They knew how to fight smarter, not harder. They'd been through battles where brute strength wasn't always the key to survival, and they had learned to rely on tactics, timing, and strategy to win. They might have been slower, but their cunning and ability to read the battlefield often more than made up for it. One notable example of such warriors was the legendary 14th century knight, Sir John Hawkwood. Now, Sir John didn't exactly fit the traditional mould of a knight. He wasn't born into nobility and had no grand family name to live up to. Instead, he made his name as a mercenary, which was somewhat of a dirty word in the medieval world. Mercenaries were viewed with suspicion, often considered little more than hired swords, ready to change allegiance for the highest bidder. But Hawkwood's skill on the battlefield was undeniable, and his story is one of those rare instances where an old warrior didn't fade into obscurity, but instead became something of a legend. Hawkwood's career didn't end with his advancing years. In fact, he remained active and influential well into his old age, commanding armies of men during the Italian wars. By the time he reached his 60s, Sir John was leading his mercenary group through wars and conflicts, proving that age wasn't necessarily a hindrance to military success. His later years saw him commanding some of the most notable battles in Europe, and his leadership was highly respected by both his peers and the soldiers who followed him. Historians still argue whether Hawkwood's success was due to his battle-hardened instincts or his ability to adapt to the changing nature of warfare. What is clear, however, is that his age did not deter him from fighting quite the opposite. His longevity in the mercenary world was a testament to the fact that, in the medieval world, an old warrior with experience could still be a formidable force. But this isn't to say that all elderly warriors were so fortunate. The reality was that most elderly soldiers didn't get to retire with a fine pension and a commendation for their service. No, most of them fought until their bodies could no longer take it. But let's not forget about the emotional and psychological toll that old age took on medieval soldiers. Imagine the frustration of watching your comrades, many of them younger and more capable, charge into battle, while you, the old veteran, had to sit back and watch, perhaps offering advice from the sidelines, or even participating in less physically demanding roles. Some elderly soldiers, in fact, found themselves relegated to the role of advisors, strategists, or even mentors, passing down their battle-hardened wisdom to the next generation. While this role might seem somewhat less glamorous than being on the front lines, it was one that many elderly warriors embraced with pride. They knew that their years of experience still held tremendous value, and they could contribute to the war effort in ways that didn't involve wielding a sword. For many of these veterans, their identities were so closely tied to their status as warriors that the idea of retiring from battle was unthinkable. This often led to a mental struggle as they watched the next generation of soldiers rise up and take the reins. But it wasn't just the warriors themselves who had to come to terms with old age. The military commanders and lords who relied on these experienced men had to figure out how to balance the value of experience with the physical limitations of age. Some noblemen and generals kept their elderly warriors close by, respecting their counsel and knowledge. Others, however, simply saw them as liabilities, casting them aside when the time came to choose who would go into battle. It's important to note that old warriors weren't just a product of the upper classes. While knights and nobles certainly had their elderly soldiers, there were also plenty of common folk who fought well past the age when most people would have called it quits. These were the men who didn't have a cushy estate to return to after the war was over. Instead, they kept fighting because it was their only means of survival. The middle and lower classes, with their limited resources and lack of wealth, couldn't afford the luxury of retirement. For them, every battle was a chance to earn a living, and every year that they managed to stay alive was a victory in itself. Now, let's take a moment to think about the role of elderly women in medieval combat, which is something of a rarity, but not unheard of. While it's true that women were generally not permitted to fight on the front lines, with a few notable exceptions, like Joan of Arc, there were women who took up arms to defend their homes and families. In some cases, elderly women were called upon to protect their homes when their husbands or sons were away at war. They may not have been trained warriors, but they certainly weren't afraid to wield a weapon if the need arose. Some historians even believe that certain older women took part in skirmishes or defended their villages during invasions, showing that age didn't necessarily correlate with a lack of bravery. It's easy to imagine these women sitting by the hearth in their old age, weaving baskets or telling tales. But the reality is that some of them were as fierce and determined as the men who fought in the fields. They were often the unsung heroes, performing feats of courage and strength that would have gone unnoticed by the larger historical narrative, while they may not have been as prominent as their male counterparts. These women played crucial roles in the protection of their homes and families. In the end, the old warriors of medieval times were a testament to human perseverance, despite the physical toll that combat took on their bodies. They refused to give up their identity as soldiers, whether they were leading armies, advising commanders, or simply picking up a sword for one last battle. They showed that age wasn't necessarily a barrier to bravery. In fact, in many cases, their experience made them even more formidable than their younger counterparts. And while not all of them made it to the end of the battle, those who did were living proof that the spirit of a warrior doesn't fade with age. By now, you're starting to understand that surviving old age in the Middle Ages wasn't just about getting by, it was about finding ways to thrive, even when your body started to betray you. We've seen how older warriors and knights managed to stay in the game longer than most would expect, and now it's time to turn the spotlight to something perhaps even more surprising: the elderly, who became the true lifeblood of their communities. Yes, that's right, the old folks, the ones who were too worn out to swing swords or saddle horses, often found their second wind in the world of commerce and agriculture. And, spoiler alert, this wasn't a cushy retirement. Far from it. Let's start with the farmers. Now, you might be thinking, well, old people on farms, that's nothing new. And you'd be right. But in the Middle Ages, the older generation's connection to the land went far beyond just planting crops. By this time, many of the elderly were regarded as the stewards of agricultural knowledge, essentially. The unsung heroes who kept the farming world running. They had the wisdom, the knowledge of seasons, and the skills that the younger generation simply didn't have. This wasn't a job that could be learned overnight. It was about knowing when to plant, when to harvest, and how to tend to the land to make sure it would yield food year after year. Historians still argue whether the medieval peasantry, especially the elderly, actually had more control over land than we often give them credit for. Some believe that the elderly, especially the patriarchs and matriarchs of family farms, could have held significant sway over decisions made in farming communities. Having been the ones to ensure survival over generations, this made them invaluable to the local economy. If you were lucky enough to live near an older farmer, you could often find yourself on the receiving end of some life-saving advice or knowledge about crops that have been passed down through the ages. On a farm, the elderly were critical to the daily operations. Take, for instance, the planting of wheat, while the younger generations might have been more suited to labour-intensive tasks. The elderly often had an intimate knowledge of which wheat strain grew best in certain soils or climates. They also understood the delicate timing required to ensure a successful harvest. And if that weren't enough, the elderly farmers had a knack for understanding animal husbandry. It wasn't uncommon for older men and women to know exactly how to care for and breed livestock, from cows to sheep to chickens, and keep them thriving year-round. But don't think their only role was to stay home and supervise, although we all know that's a full-time job in itself, as the primary caretakers of animals and crops. These elders had to get out there with the younger folk to help maintain the farm, whether it was tending to the fields, slaughtering animals for meat, or even helping in the harvest. The idea of retirement as we understand it didn't exist in the medieval world. No one, especially those of advanced age, could afford to sit idle and wait for their final days. Instead, they worked alongside their families, ensuring the survival of their homes and making sure their farms would be ready for the next generation. But the elderly farmers weren't alone in their efforts. The market economy in the Middle Ages, though limited by today's standards, provided ample opportunities for the elderly to make their mark in commerce as well. Older men and women became skilled traders, working as merchants or even shopkeepers. They used their accumulated knowledge of goods, barter and trade routes to establish themselves as crucial players in the medieval economy. In fact, some elderly people even served as early-day entrepreneurs, starting businesses that would last for generations. Take, for instance, the village markets. Elderly merchants who had learned the art of negotiation and haggling could often hold their own against younger, more energetic traders. These were individuals who had spent decades learning about the value of wool, grain, pottery, or other tradable goods over time. They developed strong relationships with other merchants, often exchanging goods across long distances and even countries. In some instances, the elderly merchant could be a pillar of a small town's economy. They were known for their reliability, skill, and knowledge of goods, and their ability to keep things running smoothly made them essential to trade. Moreover, elderly women often ran households that functioned as small-scale businesses, especially when it came to baking, brewing, or textiles. Take the case of the local baker, an elderly woman with decades of experience baking bread, cakes, or pies could produce high-quality goods that were highly sought after in the village. Her recipes, passed down through generations, became prized possessions, her goods an essential part of daily life in her community. And let's not forget about brewers. While you might think of a brewery today as a big, bustling operation with modern technology, medieval brewing was a personal affair, often done by older women who passed on their craft to others. This wasn't just a noble woman's hobby. These elderly brewers were known for producing ale or beer that was sold in local taverns or even to soldiers passing through. Their ability to craft a beverage that could take the edge off after a long day of work made them indispensable, especially during the colder months when alcohol consumption increased. You might say they were the original craft brewers, with recipes carefully guarded and passed down through the generations. But it wasn't all about working for the family farm or running a small business. Let's look at the elderly in terms of their social standing. Although medieval societies were notoriously hierarchical, the elderly, especially the wise or experienced, could often command a significant amount of respect and influence. The respect for the elderly was deeply ingrained in many medieval cultures, and older individuals were often seen as the moral and spiritual guides of their communities. Their counsel was sought after by not just their families, but by local rulers and clergy as well. In a society that often prized youth and strength, being an elder who could advise kings, nobles, or even the local village council was no small feat. It wasn't uncommon for older men and women to serve as advisors, helping to resolve disputes, direct the community, or even arbitrate in legal matters. In some cases, older women, especially those who were widows or had children of their own, were able to wield considerable political influence. They could leverage their wealth, property, or familial connections to make a difference in the world around them, and their wisdom often made them valuable in the eyes of others. But here's where the middle-aged and elderly found their niche despite not having the physical stamina of the younger generation. The elderly had something that couldn't be easily replaced: time. They had time to observe, time to learn, and time to pass on everything they had gathered over a lifetime. The elderly, whether they were the stewards of farms, the keepers of businesses, or the respected advisors of their communities, were not to be underestimated. While they may have lacked the ability to wield a sword or march off to battle, they wielded something even more powerful: the weight of experience. So, the next time you picture an elderly person in the medieval world, don't just think of someone who has been cast aside, forgotten, or left to their own devices. Think of them as survivors working behind the scenes to make sure the world continued turning. And, honestly, their contributions may just be the reason the rest of society was able to survive as long as it did. Age may have slowed them down, but it never stopped them from finding ways to thrive. Now that you've seen how the elderly could not only survive, but thrive in the medieval world. Let's turn our attention to the more personal, intimate side of old age. That's right, we're diving deep into the question of how the elderly navigated personal relationships, love, and brace yourself, romance. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Elderly people in the Middle Ages romance, so that sounds like a stretch, but stick with me, because in the Middle Ages, old age wasn't a sentence to loneliness and desolation, far from it. In fact, for some, old age was a time for reinvention, and believe it or not, for a surprising number of elderly people, their golden years included the possibility of second or even third marriages. Let's start with the reality of medieval marriage. Unlike today, where we tend to think of marriage as something that starts in youth and lasts until death do us part, medieval marriage was a much more fluid, socially driven affair, while young marriages were common, particularly among the noble classes. Old age didn't automatically banish you to the sidelines when it came to matters of the heart. For widows and widowers, the idea of remarrying wasn't just an option, it was often encouraged. Now, don't go imagining something out of a romantic comedy where an elderly knight and a noble woman fall in love at first sight, riding off into the sunset together. No, this was practical, often transactional, and just a bit strategic. Marriages in the medieval world weren't always about love as we understand it today. They were about securing land, wealth, and alliances. So, if you were an elderly widow or widower, remarrying meant securing someone to care for your property, to continue your family line, or simply to ensure that you wouldn't be left in a state of vulnerability as you grew older. But it wasn't all about securing wealth or land. In fact, historians still argue about how much affection was actually involved in these marriages. Did elderly couples form deep, meaningful bonds in their later years? Or was the idea of a second marriage more about mutual convenience and shared history? The jury's still out on that one, but it's safe to say that many elderly people didn't shy away from the possibility of a second or third marriage if it meant improving their quality of life or strengthening their position in society. For elderly women, remarriage could be a form of social reintegration. If a woman was widowed, she was often left in a precarious position, especially if she had no family or wealth of her own. But remarrying, even in old age, provided her with the opportunity to gain security and perhaps even power. A widow could marry a man of higher social standing. Or, alternatively, an older woman might marry someone younger in a kind of mutually beneficial relationship. It wasn't uncommon for elderly women to use their status, wealth, or land to secure a comfortable position for themselves. And in many cases, they were still highly sought after. This brings us to the topic of personal relationships and physical intimacy. As uncomfortable as it may sound, medieval people weren't completely averse to the idea of older people remaining sexually active. In fact, some elderly people remained quite passionate well into their later years, although our modern sensibilities often shy away from the thought of elderly people engaging in intimate relationships. The medieval world didn't have the same hang-ups. These were people who still had desires, and whether or not those desires were as intense as those of a younger person, they were still important. Older men, particularly those who were wealthy or in positions of power, often found it quite easy to attract younger women. This wasn't necessarily a matter of attraction, as much as it was about securing a position in society. A younger woman could marry an elderly man and gain financial security, protection, and status. However, it was often the older men who were seen as the winners in these unions. But don't think for a second that this was a one-sided affair. Many elderly men, especially those who had the means to do so, were not opposed to the idea of enjoying physical pleasure in their later years. For elderly women, On the other hand, the social dynamics were more complex. If a woman was widowed, it could be difficult for her to find a partner without the stigma of being past her prime. However, this wasn't always the case. Some older women were able to forge new relationships based on shared interests, common backgrounds, or mutual respect in many ways. An older woman's status in society played a significant role in her ability to form new, meaningful relationships. The more land or wealth she had, the more likely she was to find someone interested in forging a connection. So, in a way, the elderly in medieval society were constantly navigating a delicate balance between love, desire, and social survival. These relationships weren't always idealised or based on deep romantic love, but they were a necessary part of life. Elders often used their marriages, relationships, and alliances as tools for survival, sometimes even for their own protection. But that doesn't mean they didn't find ways to make them work, sometimes. These late life unions turned out to be successful, with both partners finding comfort, companionship, and yes, even love. In fact, one of the most remarkable aspects of old age in the Middle Ages is that people didn't simply fade away or retreat into solitude when they reached their later years. No, they still engaged with the world around them. They worked, they loved, they partnered, and they navigated the complex social web of medieval life with the same vigour they had in their youth. Whether it was the bond of marriage or a more informal companionship, the elderly knew how to make the most of their relationships in a society that often expected them to fade into the background. And for those who didn't remarry or find love in the traditional sense, there were other avenues for companionship in many medieval communities. The elderly were highly valued for their wisdom and experience, and they often had a rich network of friends, family, and acquaintances. If you weren't fortunate enough to remarry, you could still rely on your community to provide support, affection, and the occasional laugh or shared story. So, while medieval old age may not have been free from loneliness, it wasn't devoid of companionship either. As we move on from this topic of relationships, let's take a moment to reflect on how these romantic and personal dynamics fit into the larger picture of medieval life. For the elderly, love, companionship, and social interaction weren't just about survival, they were also about identity. How did society view you as you aged? Were you still a respected member of the community? Were you still capable of contributing to the greater good? Whether through marriage, business, or simply by sharing your wisdom? These were questions that every elderly person in the Middle Ages had to answer. You see, surviving the Middle Ages as an old person wasn't just about keeping your body healthy, it was about staying connected to the world around you. It was about finding a place in society, a place in relationships, and a way to contribute to the ongoing story of life in medieval times, whether through marriage, mentorship, or friendship. The elderly continued to play a crucial role in shaping the world around them, and it was their wisdom, experience, and resilience that helped to keep the medieval world running long after their youth had passed. Alright, now that we've explored the romantic side of things, let's tackle another crucial aspect of surviving old age in medieval times: your health. You might be thinking, wait, health in the Middle Ages? Wasn't it just a constant struggle of disease, infection, and misery? And yes, you'd be right, but let's not forget that despite the lack of modern medicine, medieval people had some surprisingly effective ways to manage their health, at least for the time being. First off, let's acknowledge the obvious life expectancy in the medieval world was nothing to write home about. If you were lucky enough to reach the age of 40, you were already living in rarefied air, and if you managed to live into your 60s or beyond, well, you were a true anomaly. The average life expectancy at birth was somewhere in the 30s, though it's worth noting that high infant mortality skewed this figure. Many people, especially peasants, never made it to old age, so if you did manage to survive long enough to see your golden years, you'd certainly earned them. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Despite all the plague, tooth decay, and general lack of hygiene, yes, the Middle Ages were famously smelly. The elderly could and did live somewhat healthy lives, often for much longer than you might expect. The secret's a combination of lifestyle, diet, and the fact that many medieval people simply didn't live long enough to get the chronic conditions that plague us today. Let's take a look at lifestyle first. The medieval world was tough, yes, but it was also incredibly active. If you were an elderly peasant, you were likely still doing hard labour tending to animals, growing crops, or working with your hands. That meant plenty of physical exercise, which, in the absence of modern gyms, was a natural way to keep your body in decent shape. Physical work may not have been kind on your joints, but it did keep your muscles strong. And that made a huge difference when it came to aging. For the more affluent members of society, physical activity was still part of the equation, while knights and nobles may not have been doing manual labour. They often enjoyed activities like hunting, horseback riding, and walking the grounds of their estates. That may sound a little cushy to us today, but these were activities that kept their bodies moving and their stamina up, things we now associate with fitness, even if the medieval aristocrats didn't see it that way. Now, as for diet, let's not sugarcoat it. The medieval diet was, for the most part, pretty rough by our standards. If you were poor, you probably ate a lot of bread, vegetables, and the occasional bit of meat when you could get it. The rich, on the other hand, dined on meat, fish, and a variety of luxurious dishes. And while that certainly sounds more appealing, it wasn't necessarily the healthiest option either. The high-fat diet of the medieval nobility often led to issues like gout, which was a common condition among older people in the aristocracy. But here's the thing, while our modern diet of processed foods, sugar, and lack of physical activity might seem like the root of all evil when it comes to aging, the medieval world didn't have that problem. People ate mostly whole foods, and they moved their bodies every day. Sure, there were no kale smoothies or multivitamins, but the basic principles of a healthy lifestyle activity and balanced nutrition were still in play. Speaking of balanced nutrition, let's touch on a few of the medieval remedies for ailments. Now, I don't want you to get any ideas about trying medieval medicine out for yourself, but it's interesting to note how people in the Middle Ages did their best to keep themselves in one piece. Herbal remedies were common, and people used everything from rosemary to garlic to treat a variety of ailments. While we now know that some of these herbs actually have medicinal properties, the medieval people didn't know about all the scientific reasons behind their remedies, they just knew what worked. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of medieval treatments, but one thing is for sure, they were incredibly resourceful. Take, for example, the medieval health tonic made from a mixture of herbs, vinegar, and sometimes even wine. It wasn't just for the rich, either. Everyone had their own version of these potions to stave off sickness, and some of them were surprisingly good for you. While medieval medicine may have been primitive by our standards, many of the natural remedies they relied on still form the basis of alternative medicine today. But despite all the remedies and health strategies, old age in the Middle Ages wasn't without its challenges. Life didn't magically get easier as you got older, and in fact, as you aged, you became more susceptible to injuries and diseases. Arthritis, for example, was a common affliction among the elderly, thanks to the physical toll that working on a farm or riding a horse for years could take on your joints. The elderly were also vulnerable to diseases like tuberculosis, which was rampant at the time. And of course, there was the ever-present threat of the Black Death. However, let's not forget that medieval people didn't live in a vacuum. They had a different relationship with illness and death than we do today. The constant presence of disease meant that people were, to a certain extent, more accustomed to the idea of mortality. The elderly often accepted illness as part of the natural order of life. In fact, many older people lived with a certain level of pain and discomfort for years, as there were few ways to treat chronic conditions. But if you were lucky enough to live into old age, you were often able to gain the respect of your peers, not just because of your wisdom, but because you had lived through so much. One of the more fascinating aspects of old age in medieval times was how death was viewed. Today, we're obsessed with youth and longevity, constantly seeking ways to prolong our lives and avoid the inevitable. But in the Middle Ages, death was just another part of life. The elderly were often seen as living witnesses to the past, carrying with them the knowledge and stories of their generations. It wasn't uncommon for older people to pass down their wisdom to younger generations, which was vital in a time when education was often informal and passed down through oral traditions. This brings us to the question of religion. Medieval Christians believed that old age was a blessing and that it was a sign of favour from God. In fact, the elderly were often highly respected within their communities, and they were seen as closer to the divine. Church teachings emphasised the idea that the elderly had special wisdom to offer, and many older people took on roles as spiritual guides and mentors. Of course, not all elderly people were treated equally. Social status played a major role in how the elderly were treated. A wealthy nobleman could expect to live out his days in relative comfort, surrounded by servants and family. But for the poor, aging was often a grueling process, without the means to care for themselves. Many elderly peasants lived out their final years in poverty, relying on charity and the kindness of neighbours. In conclusion, surviving old age in the Middle Ages wasn't easy, but it wasn't a hopeless endeavour either. Whether you were an active peasant working in the fields, a nobleman enjoying the fruits of your labour, or a spiritual guide imparting wisdom to the next generation, medieval society had a place for you. Your health may have been precarious, but with a bit of luck, a strong constitution, and a bit of medieval know-how, you could thrive in your later years. You weren't just surviving, you were living, in your own way. As we continue down this winding path through the medieval world, let's talk about one of the most crucial aspects of surviving as an older person, your social life, in today's world. Staying socially connected is considered essential for mental health, but it turns out the Middle Ages were no different in this regard. The social fabric of medieval life was complex, and relationships were often the key to survival. But here's the catch as an older person. Your role in society could either be a blessing or a curse, depending on your position, your family, and how well you could adapt to the evolving dynamics of the time. Let's start with the obvious. Your social status played a massive role in how well you would age. If you were part of the nobility, your old age likely came with a certain level of comfort. You would still be surrounded by family, servants, and perhaps even a few friendly knights or clergy. Your title would carry weight, and it would be your job to offer wisdom and leadership to the younger generation. This kind of social structure was not just a matter of prestige, it was vital for the functioning of society. As an elder, you'd be revered, and in many cases, your opinion would be sought after when it came to important decisions, whether it was a matter of family inheritance, local disputes, or even regional politics. But let's be real for a second, being an elderly noble wasn't a free pass to sit back and relax. while the world turned, no, you still had responsibilities. You were expected to pass on your knowledge, and sometimes that meant preparing your heirs to take over the family estates. There was an old saying in medieval Europe, "The old must teach the young, or the young will not learn." So, if you were an elderly noble, your wisdom was considered vital to the survival of your lineage. You might have spent your later years overseeing the education of your children and grandchildren, imparting knowledge about the land, finances, politics, and even the art of courtly love. Now, I know you're probably wondering, what about the rest of society? What about the peasants and common folk who didn't have the luxury of estates to manage or royal titles to uphold? Well, the picture isn't so bleak for them either. Even though life as a peasant was tough, community life was rich with connection. In the absence of modern conveniences like television or social media, people in medieval villages had a much stronger connection to one another. This could be both a blessing and a curse, depending on how well you got along with your neighbours. If you were an elderly peasant, chances are you spent a good deal of your life working alongside your family and neighbours in old age. You might find yourself surrounded by people who knew you well and could provide assistance when needed. Community ties were incredibly strong in rural villages, and while you may have been expected to keep working well into your older years, there was also a deep sense of mutual support. In fact, medieval peasants often formed informal networks of help, providing food, shelter, and even care when someone in the community was ill or elderly. However, that doesn't mean your social life was all sunshine and rainbows. The downside to this tight-knit community structure was that if you were seen as a burden, whether due to age, illness, or disability, you could easily become the subject of gossip or scorn. People who were considered useless to the community, like elderly people who could no longer work the land, were sometimes left to fend for themselves. It was a harsh reality, but it was a reality nonetheless. If you had no family to support you, your survival could be dependent on the generosity of others. The elderly often found themselves at the mercy of the local church or charitable organisations, who provided care to the poor and elderly, though these resources were often scarce. Let's not forget about the religious aspect of medieval life either. The church had a significant influence on the lives of the elderly, and it wasn't just because it was a place to pray and find solace in the afterlife. In fact, the church served as a social hub for many elderly people. Older people who were no longer able to work often took refuge in monasteries or convents, where they could live out their remaining years in a relatively peaceful environment. Monasteries, in particular, were places where the elderly could find a sense of purpose by contributing to the spiritual life of the community. Some elderly monks and nuns spent their final years in quiet contemplation or writing religious texts, which were then passed on to future generations. Historians still debate the role of the elderly in religious communities, with some arguing that it was a way for the church to provide support to its members, while others see it as a way for the church to maintain control over its ageing population. Regardless, the elderly were often able to find comfort and a sense of belonging within the walls of the monastery. It wasn't just about faith, it was about community and the chance to continue contributing to society in a way that felt meaningful, even in old age. Let's turn our attention for a moment to the elderly women of the Middle Ages. While it's true that women had a more restricted role in society compared to men, elderly women often held an important place within their families and communities. In rural areas, older women were often revered for their knowledge of herbal medicine, farming techniques, and child rearing. They were the healers and caregivers of the village, and their wisdom was invaluable. In fact, elderly women were often seen as the glue that held families together, especially if they were grandmothers or great-grandmothers. They played a vital role in nurturing the next generation, passing on traditions, stories and practical knowledge to younger women. However, it wasn't always easy being an elderly woman in the Middle Ages. Society didn't always view older women with the same respect it gave older men. In some cases, elderly women were seen as frail, feeble, and past their prime. There were even times when older women were accused of witchcraft, simply because they lived alone, or because they were seen as too independent. It was a hard reality for many women, but despite the challenges, the elderly women who managed to survive often held the key to maintaining the health and well-being of their families. We've covered the importance of family and community for the elderly in medieval times. But let's not forget that medieval society was also rife with conflict. War, famine, and disease were all part of the landscape, and these factors could significantly impact the quality of life for the elderly. If you were an older person living through a period of war, you were often left to fend for yourself, as younger members of the community were off fighting. In times of famine, the elderly were often the first to suffer from a lack of food. Disease, too, was a constant threat, the Black Death, which wiped out a large portion of the European population, was particularly devastating for the elderly, who were already more vulnerable to illness. However, as we've discussed earlier, the elderly were resilient, and many survived these hardships by relying on the strength of their social ties and community. In the end, survival in the Middle Ages as an older person wasn't just about health or physical strength, it was about adaptability. The elderly who thrived were those who could find a place for themselves within the ever-changing world around them. They were the ones who knew how to navigate the complex social structures of medieval life. Whether they were noble, peasant, or clergy, they understood the value of family, community, and faith, and they found ways to contribute to society in meaningful ways, even in their later years. Now that we've explored the social structures and roles of elderly individuals in medieval society, let's delve into the darker side of aging, something that might make you think twice before wishing you could time travel back to the medieval era. After all, while your social life might be better than a lonely hermit's, it wasn't always smooth sailing when it came to your health. In fact, surviving old age was a real gamble in the Middle Ages. There were few modern conveniences to help you age gracefully, no heated blankets, no fancy joint supplements, and certainly no yoga classes to keep you limber. Instead, older people had to rely on their wit, their resilience, and a little bit of medieval medicine, which, let's just say, wasn't exactly known for its effectiveness. First, let's talk about the medicine or lack thereof. By today's standards, medieval healthcare would seem a bit unconventional. If you were an elderly person suffering from joint pain, you might have been treated with a concoction of herbs and potions, some of which might have worked sort of, while others were downright bizarre. For example, in some cases, medieval healers would recommend that you rub your aching joints with a mixture of boiled mice or even use the fat of a dead animal to ease the pain. These treatments might sound shocking to us now, but back then they were considered legitimate methods of healing. The prevailing belief was that the body's humours needed to be balanced, and this could be achieved through various remedies, even if they were a bit questionable in their methods. Historians still argue whether medieval medicine truly did anything for the elderly, or if it was all just placebo, an elaborate system of rituals and superstitions. Some suggest that these strange remedies might have had an effect on the body's psychological state, making people feel better simply because they believed they were being treated, whether or not they worked physically. They certainly had an emotional impact. Being elderly in medieval times often meant facing the prospect of a slow decline without much hope for improvement. However, the power of belief shouldn't be underestimated. When you're old and aching, even a little hope can go a long way. On the other hand, there were some genuinely advanced medical techniques for the time, especially in monasteries and among the clergy. Monks were some of the most learned individuals in medieval Europe, and many monasteries had extensive herbal gardens that were used for medicinal purposes. These gardens provided herbs such as mint, rosemary, and sage, which were believed to have healing properties. The monks would brew teas, make ointments, and prepare poultices to treat a variety of ailments. While these remedies might not have been as effective as modern medicine, they were often the best option available. In fact, some historians argue that the monks' knowledge of medicinal plants helped to lay the groundwork for future medical advances in Europe. But even with these remedies, old age was still a dangerous game in medieval Europe. Without the benefit of modern medical care, elderly people were far more vulnerable to illnesses, injuries, and infections. A simple wound could easily become infected, leading to complications that could be fatal. And if you had any chronic conditions, such as arthritis or heart disease, there was little that could be done to manage them. The elderly were often left to suffer in silence, with their families or communities providing what little care they could. In fact, one of the most dangerous aspects of aging in the Middle Ages was the constant threat of disease. Plague outbreaks were common, and when they hit, they didn't care whether you were young or old. In 1347, the Black Death swept across Europe, decimating entire communities and leaving countless elderly people to die alone. People believed that old age made you more susceptible to the disease, and if you were already frail, the chances of survival were slim. The Black Death was a grim reminder of how precarious life could be for the elderly in medieval times. But let's not get too lost in the grim reality of medieval medicine. Despite the dangers and challenges, the elderly in medieval times managed to live their lives in ways that were resilient and often surprisingly resourceful. Many older people had a wealth of practical knowledge that helped them survive, whether it was the ability to identify herbs for healing or the knowledge of how to grow their own food. This knowledge was often passed down through generations, and the elderly were seen as the keepers of important traditions. In a world where literacy was not widespread, the elderly were often the ones who could tell stories, offer advice, and teach younger generations how to survive in a harsh and unpredictable world. What's more, there was a certain dignity in being elderly in the Middle Ages. Yes, it was a hard life, but there was respect for the wisdom that came with age. In fact, older individuals were often seen as a stabilising force within families and communities. They were the ones who had seen it all: the rise and fall of empires, the ebb and flow of wars, the cycles of harvests and famine. Their experience gave them an authority that younger people could only dream of. This respect for the elderly was especially true when it came to matters of inheritance and land. In many cases, the elderly were the ones who controlled property and wealth, passing it down to their heirs upon their death. They held the power to make decisions about who would inherit the family estate, which could have a significant impact on the future of the family. The old were also often the ones who negotiated marriages, which, in a feudal society, could determine the political and economic future of entire regions. In the absence of modern insurance, pension plans, or social security, the elderly relied heavily on their families to care for them in their later years. If you had a large family and were well respected in the community, you were more likely to have the support you needed to survive old age. But if you were alone, or if your family had no resources to share, your old age could be a lonely and difficult time. In some cases, elderly people who had no family to care for them turned to the church, which often provided shelter and care for the poor and elderly. Monasteries and convents were a refuge for many elderly individuals, offering them food, shelter, and even spiritual solace in their final years. As we wrap up this section, it's important to remember that the Middle Ages were a time of incredible social and cultural change. There were many obstacles to overcome, especially for the elderly. But despite these challenges, there was a certain resilience in the way people lived. The elderly weren't simply passive victims of time, they were active participants in their societies, contributing to their communities and passing down valuable knowledge and traditions. In a world that often seemed cruel and unforgiving, the elderly had their place, and it was one that was respected, even if the path to survival wasn't always easy. As we near the end of our journey through the rough and often unforgiving landscape of ageing in the Middle Ages, it's important to reflect on the bigger picture of medieval life. By now, you've witnessed the incredible struggles that older people faced, from battling the harsh physical realities of ageing to navigating the fragile social systems of the time. It wasn't an easy life by any stretch of the imagination. And yet, if you were an elderly person living through the Middle Ages, you had to find ways to not just survive, but often thrive in your own way, defying the expectations of a society that valued youth, strength, and vigour above all else. When you look at the medieval world through the lens of the elderly, you realise something truly remarkable. The Middle Ages weren't simply about brutal hardship. Sure, there were wars, disease, and political unrest. But at the same time, it was a time when knowledge, experience, and wisdom were cherished, especially when it came to the elderly. While old age came with its share of challenges, the elderly in the medieval period weren't exactly relegated to a life of invisibility or uselessness. Quite the opposite. In fact, despite all the odds stacked against them, many elderly people played pivotal roles in the family, community, and even on the grand stage of politics. Let's start by considering what would have been an obvious reality for the medieval elderly. Their lives were shaped by the hand they were dealt. Ageing was not an expected privilege for everyone. Life expectancy was lower than it is today, and a significant portion of the population died young. But if you made it into your 60s or beyond, that was a big deal. You had already survived the bubonic plague or any number of other diseases, and had lived through enough personal trials to earn the kind of respect that came with age. This, in itself, is something we can take a moment to appreciate. Imagine surviving the Black Death, which wiped out up to 60% of Europe's population, and emerging on the other side, not only still standing, but ready to guide the younger generation. You'd certainly have earned a spot at the table in your community. Even if your knees creaked when you sat down, the idea of being an elder in medieval society was much more complex than simply being a frail, ageing individual. Elders had a unique position in their communities, as we discussed before. They were often the holders of knowledge, not just about practical survival, but about cultural practices, moral teachings, and even the divine. Let's not forget that the church had an enormous influence over medieval life, and it was often the elderly who had the deepest understanding of religious teachings and rituals. Monks and nuns, in particular, were revered for their spiritual wisdom, and many elderly people, if they were lucky enough to be in good health, were able to pass down that knowledge to the younger generation. In fact, monasteries often offered a relatively peaceful and secure haven for elderly people. These sanctuaries were places where the elderly could enjoy some semblance of comfort in their final years, free from the dangers that plagued the outside world. And even in these monasteries, elderly monks often played a key role in maintaining the religious and intellectual life of the community. With their long years of study and meditation, they were the keepers of sacred texts, able to preserve the teachings of the past and ensure that they were passed on to future generations. It wasn't a life of luxury, but it certainly had its rewards. But for those elderly people who didn't find refuge in monasteries, survival often meant finding ways to make do with whatever resources were available. Some elderly individuals continued to work well into their old age, not just for financial reasons, but out of necessity. Many elderly women, for example, worked as weavers, brewers, or caregivers, roles that kept them active and involved in their communities. In fact, some elderly women in the Middle Ages had more freedom and autonomy than their younger counterparts. They were often the ones who held the knowledge of household management, child rearing, and healing, and this knowledge was highly valued in their communities. However, it's not all sunshine and roses for the medieval elderly. In the absence of social safety nets like pensions or social security, the elderly were often left vulnerable if they didn't have family or community support. When their health began to fail, they were at the mercy of others. If their family had moved away or if they were estranged, they could easily fall into poverty and isolation. The elderly without family or support systems often relied on the church or local charitable organisations to survive. But that was far from a guarantee. The harshness of medieval life meant that if you didn't have someone to look after you, your survival prospects weren't great. Historians still argue about the true social status of the elderly during this time. Some suggest that, while the elderly were revered for their wisdom and experience, they were also vulnerable to being pushed aside in favour of younger, more vigorous individuals who were seen as more valuable contributors to society. It's a complex issue that has been debated for centuries. Some scholars believe that, despite the respect given to the elderly, the reality of medieval life often meant that the old were at the mercy of their circumstances, with their worth determined by their ability to contribute to society. Others argue that the elderly were still seen as central figures in the family and community, with their value derived not just from their physical ability, but from the knowledge and wisdom they could impart. In either case, one thing is clear: aging in the Middle Ages wasn't a straightforward experience for some. It was a time of respect and authority, a time when they could rely on their accumulated wisdom to help guide their family or community. For others, it was a time of hardship, where illness, isolation, and poverty cast long shadows over their lives. And as we've seen, the experiences of the elderly were deeply influenced by a range of factors: family, social class, and access to resources being just a few. So, where does that leave us? Well, if you're still hanging on to that dream of time travelling to the Middle Ages, let's just say this: it's a world full of both wonder and danger. You'd be faced with challenges that we can hardly imagine today, but you'd also have the chance to experience a society where wisdom and age were honoured in ways we sometimes forget in our modern world. You might find yourself revered, respected, and looked to for guidance, or you might end up struggling to survive in a society that has little patience for the elderly who can't contribute. It's a gamble, but then again, what in life isn't? So as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that the medieval world wasn't just about knights in shining armour or plagues that wiped out entire populations. It was about the incredible resilience of those who lived through it, including the elderly who managed to survive against all odds. And maybe, just maybe, you'll wake up tomorrow with a new appreciation for the modern comforts that help us grow old with a little more ease and dignity.